Good day everyone, especially to our instructor, Ma'am Ana Marie Valdez. I am Kent Ayan Silverio, a BS Ed Science student from SKSU, Sultan Kudarat State University Access Campus. And I am here to present to you my teaching demonstration on the topic biomolecules. And now, let's proceed to my actual demonstration. I am asking everyone to please stand for our prayer that will be led to us by our Mayor. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. So may I know secretary who is absent this morning? Oh, very good. There is none. So good morning, class. Today we will be having a new topic. And before anything else, I would like you to put your cell phones on your bags and pick up some pieces of paper before sitting. And during the discussion, if you have any excuses, you can just raise your hand and state your reason for your excuses. Understood? Okay, very good.
So I have prepared an activity for you all to answer. And so if you answer it all right, you can have an idea of what our lesson is all about. But first, I need anyone to read the instruction on the screen. Thank you. Okay, so before answering each items, you just raise your hand and then wait for your name to be called or acknowledged by me, your teacher. Understood? Okay, very good. So, here is the first item. So, anyone who can answer this first item? Yes? Very good. It's carbohydrates. Next. Okay, so it's lipids. Next one. Yes? Very good. It's protein. Next one. Good guess, but you didn't get the correct answer. Another? Very good. It's nucleic acid. The last one? Very good. It's biomolecules.
You all did a great job. And since you already answered it all right, I know that some of you have an idea of what was our lesson is all about. So anyone who can give me our lesson is all about? Yes? Very good. Our lesson today is all about biomolecules. So how do you define biomolecules? Anyone? Yes? Okay, thank you. Now, what do you think is the importance of studying biomolecules? Anyone? Yes? Okay, thank you for your answers. And we will be knowing if your answers are all correct as we go further with our lesson. So before anything else, let me present to you first our learning objectives. So who can read the learning objectives? Yes? Okay, so thank you. One of the sayings says, you are what you eat. So do you agree with that, class? Yes. Of course, when you eat healthy foods, you can have a healthy body also. And if you eat unhealthy foods like junk foods and sodas, you can have a weak body that is vulnerable to such diseases. And whatever we consume or whatever we eat, it contributes to our health. So it is important to us to be aware of what should we eat. Now, let's compare a biomolecules from other components of our body. So, as you can see here, where we can classify a biomolecules is also known as macromolecules or large molecules. So, a macromolecules is larger than an atom and a molecule and smaller than organelles, cells, organ, and organ system of our body. Now, let's define what is biomolecules. So, a biomolecules is derived from two words, bio and molecules. So, bio means life, and a molecules, it is a combination of two or more atoms. And therefore, in this lesson, we will be going to talk about the molecules of life. So, as we go back from the previous slides, we saw that there's a lot of food going on and how this food relate with our lessons. So, a food is a source of a biomolecules that is needed for our life, or large molecules that is needed for our life.
A biomolecules is any molecules that are produced by living organisms. It includes large macromolecules such as proteins, polysaccharides, lipids, and nucleic acid.
As I have said a while ago that we typically get these biomolecules from consuming foods. And so, we human needs to eat foods to keep us alive. Thus, the food is essential to humans' life and even into plants. But they can make their own foods through the process of photosynthesis. Biomolecules have four types: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acid, and lipids. And we will going to talk about that one by one. Okay, so let's start with the carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates is the most common types of biomolecules. And it is the primary source of our energy that is needed by our body to perform such activities. And you know, class, that when we are thinking of carbohydrates, it is sugar. But it is not the sugar that we use typically to sweeten foods or we used in kitchen. It is just only the example, one of the example of sugars. And there's a lot more. So, whenever we say carbohydrates, we are not just only referring to a table sugar, but a sugar in general. And the formula for the carbohydrates is open parenthesis, CH2O close parenthesis, and where N is the number of molecules. So N represents as the integers. So for example, N is equals to 2. You can multiply it by the number of hydrogen atom inside, which is 2. So if you multiply it, the hydrogen atom will become 4. So, the building blocks of carbohydrates or the monomer of carbohydrates is monosaccharides. So, in the next slides, we will be going to encounter this word building blocks because every types of biomolecules has its own building blocks. So, a building blocks is important to form certain biomolecules like these carbohydrates. So in here, as I have said, the building blocks of carbohydrates is monosaccharides. Mono means one, and saccharides is another term for sugar. And the elements comprises the carbohydrates are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, or CHO. In here, we have the classification of carbohydrates. So we have here the simplest form, which is the monosaccharide. The next one, we have the disaccharides. And lastly, we have the polysaccharides. So we can differentiate these three classification of carbohydrates by the number of units or the number of sugars present in it. And it can be seen on the prefix. So mono means one sugar, di means two sugars, and poly means many. So first classification of carbohydrates is the monosaccharides. So as I have said, a monosaccharides is the simplest form of sugar or carbohydrates. And its chemical formula is C6H12O6. And here we have the chemical structure for the examples of these carbohydrates. So we have here the types or example of monosaccharide. First, we have here the glucose or the blood sugar. And it is similar with the dextrose. For example, a patient in a hospital can eat, so the doctor or the nurse insert dextrose on a patient to sustain the body processes. And so, it is similar with the dextrose. Next, we have the fructose or the fruit sugar. And the last example here is the galactose, which can be found in milk together with the glucose. So, again, the monosaccharides has three types or has three examples: the glucose, the fructose, and the galactose. So the next classification of carbohydrates is what we call the disaccharides, which is the double sugars. So when we combine a monosaccharides and another monosaccharides, it will form a disaccharides. So monosaccharides plus monosaccharides equals disaccharides. And the chemical formula for the disaccharides is C12H22O11. And here we have the chemical structure for the example or types of disaccharides. The first example of disaccharide here is what we call the malt sugar or maltose. And this can be seen in beer and honey. And it is formed when we combine glucose and another glucose. Again, glucose plus glucose is equals to maltose. And if we combine a glucose and a galactose, it will form a milk sugar or the lactose. And if we combine glucose and fructose, sucrose will form, and it is the table sugar that we usually use to sweeten food and in the kitchen. Next, in the last classification of carbohydrates is polysaccharides. And it is the combination of more than two sugars. And it is considered to be the complex sugar. And its chemical formula is complex as well. So the example for the polysaccharides are starch, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. And we'll be going to talk about that in the next slides. First, we have here the starches or starch, and it is usually used in energy storage in plants. And actually, all forms of carbohydrates or carbohydrates in general can form or produce quick form of energy, not just only in starch. So here we have an example of food where we can get a starch. The bread, the cereals, the potatoes, pasta, and so on. And you know, class, a starch is also used in manufacturing papers to increase its strength. And that is for starch. Next, we have the glycogen. So since in starch, it is used for the energy storage of a plants, in here, it is used for the energy storage in animals. So when a body doesn't need the glucose for energy, it stores in the liver and in the muscle in the form of glycogen. So whenever we need it again, it stores only in our liver and in our muscles. So the third example of polysaccharides is called the cellulose. And the cellulose can be found in cell walls and in the bark of trees. And this cellulose gives us fibers. Now, how do we know if the food we eat contains cellulose? Now, for example, if we eat a lot of kangkong, I know that you were familiar with kangkong, right? So, if we eat a lot of kangkong, not all of it can be digested in our body. Some of it will be excreted from our body. Because our body can't digest cellulose. There is no enzyme in helping digesting the cellulose. But the rest of the vegetables that is digested by our body, they give us dietary fibers that is important in good bacteria to aid digestion in our body. Next and the last example for the polysaccharides is what we call the chitin. And this chitin or this sugar forms exoskeleton for certain insects and crustaceans. And the example for the insects are butterfly, mosquito, and many more. And for the crustaceans, we have crabs, lobsters, and many more. So this chitins is very important to form the exoskeleton of the insects and crustaceans. So this chitin is a polysaccharides. That's all for the carbohydrates. Now let's move on to the next type of biomolecules, which is the proteins. Okay, so proteins can also be found in nutritional facts together with other biomolecules, as you can see here. Proteins are also important in building molecules, which helps us to grow. And they also transport molecules in and out of the cell, particularly in facilitated diffusion. So as you go back in your grade 8, you have learned that there are different types of cell transportation, and one of them is the facilitated diffusion. So a facilitated diffusion uses protein channel to import and export molecules in the cell. Proteins controls the speed of chemical reaction. So we have what we call the enzymes, and these enzymes are proteins. So they are responsible in controlling the speed of chemical reaction. And protein also used for growth and repair. So protein make up all the structure of all living things like the hair, the nails, the bones, the muscle. All of it are made up of protein. So in here, the building blocks of proteins is what we call the amino acid. And I know that you were familiar with the amino acid, right? Yes, because this is mostly talked about in the lesson which relates to DNA. The chemical formula for proteins are kind of complicated. So we have here RCH, open parenthesis, NH2, close parenthesis, COOH, where R is a side chain which is usually an amino acid. So if we compare this formula from carbohydrates, we can see that there is a slight difference. So here we have an extra element, which is N stands for nitrogen. So the elements comprises the proteins are CHON, which stands for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Here we have an example where we can find a protein. First one here we have the albumin of the egg or the egg white. And the next one we have here hemoglobin in our blood. Next we have here an enzymes. And these enzymes are responsible for our digestion. Here we have an amylase. You know class, an amylase is an enzyme helps to digest food within our mouth. And this produced by our saliva. So, in mouth alone, digestion occurs. And here we have some enzymes also like the trypsin, pepsin, lipase, and gelatinase, which is an enzyme also for the digestion or for further digestion. And these are all proteins. The third type of biomolecules is what we call the nucleic acid. And this nucleic acid is not necessarily from food, but they are very important component in hereditary materials because they are present in DNA. And the monomers or the building blocks of nucleic acid is the nucleotides. And the elements comprises this nucleic acid are CHONP, which stands for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphate. So what are those nucleotide bases? So we have here the adenine, the thymine, the guanine, and the cytosine. And always remember that in replication, adenine always paired with thymine. And same goes with cytosine and guanine. Now let's proceed with the last type of biomolecules. And this biomolecules is what we call the lipids. So these lipids is also an energy-giving molecules, but they are mostly referred to as stored energy molecules. And they can store more energy than any other biomolecules. The building blocks of lipids is what we call the fatty acid. And as you can see here in the structure of one of the example of lipids, you can see that it is composed of long hydrocarbon chain and attached to the carboxyl group or alcohol. The general formula for lipids is CH3, open parenthesis, CH2, close parenthesis, and COOH. And the elements present here in lipids is the same with the carbohydrates, which is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, or the CHO. The lipids provide mechanical protection for our internal organs like the kidney. It is surrounded by lipids or fats that serves as the bubble wrap to protect it from injury. These lipids also used as a waterproof covering in some plants and animals. Just like this plant, the taro plant or the gabi. So it has a layer of lipids in their leaves for them to not absorb much water, because if they absorb much water, they became bloated. So it is important to have a lipid in their leaves for them to balance the water. So an example of lipids are sterols, cholesterols, oils, nuts, waxes, and all that you have seen in the picture are all lipids, or a food where we can get lipids. A lipid is hydrophobic, which means they cannot be dissolved in water. Hydro means water, and phobic means fearing. So a lipid is water-fearing biomolecules. Lipids are also be found in nutritional facts, and they are important in our body also, but it should be in moderation. We have two forms of lipids, the saturated and the unsaturated. Saturated are those with single bonds on them, and the unsaturated are those carbon that is not saturated with the hydrogen and they have double bond. And that is all about the biomolecules and its types. But before we end this discussion, I have prepared an assessment to assess your learnings.
Get a one whole sheet of paper and answer this assessment. So this assessment is called Where Do I Belong? So read the instruction carefully and you have 5 minutes to answer this assessment. So start working now. 5 minutes have passed already, so pass your paper in front. And here is your assignment, and you will pass that to me in the next meeting.
Thank you for your listening, and I hope you learned a lot. And see you on the next meeting. Bye!